Welcome back, and I want to congratulate you on surviving our run-through of plays by Aeschylus. I know that those were challenging plays, and that Aeschylus is not the easiest author to take on, especially if you're relatively new to Greek literature. So I hope that you will find the plays of Sophocles much easier, more accessible for you. It's possible that you may be familiar with some of these plays because Oedipus Tyrannus, or more commonly in English known as Oedipus the King, is a frequent play to be found in high school curricula, so in English classes. So it's possible that you may in fact have come across Sophocles' plays in the past. This will be a great opportunity for you to be reintroduced to these plays, and we'll have the appropriate discussion questions and your Athens Day presentation, plus also a character presentation related to Sophocles. So we'll go one step further than we did with Aeschylus before. So again, I hope that this series of plays by Sophocles will be easier for you to handle, and we'll get started now introducing the playwright Sophocles. Once again, as we did with Aeschylus, we have a handout. This is number 2. So please pause your video and go to Sakai and download the handout number 2 so that you can follow it along as we discuss Sophocles. Please pause your video and open handout number 2. Ready? Excellent. Sophocles. As you can see, he's a little bit later than Aeschylus in birth. You may remember from the previous video we did on Aeschylus that his birth date is given as 525 BC. So here Sophocles, born 496 BC. The same slab of marble from Paros, Marmorparium, gives us Sophocles' birth date as well as Aeschylus's. So we have that date established for us. And as you can see, he lived a nice long record, 90 years. That is an astonishing long time for anybody to be able to live in the ancient Greek world, and Sophocles in particular, who had a long, distinguished life and career as an Athenian politician and general, as well as a playwright, definitely received quite a bit of commendation for having successfully lived as long as he did. We actually have a story about him that when he made it to 90 years, that one of his sons, who was already getting up into his 60s, wanted to get his inheritance from his father, who obviously lived a lot longer than most men would have back then, and he tried to have his father declared incompetent to run his estate. All Sophocles did in defense at his trial was to read out loud portions of his final play that you are reading in this course, Oedipus at Colonus. It was so impressive, the jury just immediately dismissed the suit. We don't know if this is a true story, but it does make for a nice little touch on Sophocles. So again, we have his birth date 496 BC, probably about right, give or take. 406 BC is a firm date established from both inside and exterior evidence on Sophocles' life, and in particular what he did with his plays. So we do know that Sophocles participated when in the 440s BC, when he would now have been about 55, in the suppression of a revolt. In videos leading up to this one, you've heard mention the Delian League, which is the network of alliances that the Athenians formed with cities out on the east coast of the Aegean Sea, along the west coast of Asia Minor, as well as the islands. This was a league, a network of allies that was supposed to work together to keep the Persians from reinvading Greece. And part of the condition was that the leaders of those cities were supposed to, and islands were supposed to pay tribute to the Athenians so that they would have money to maintain their ships. Well, this ended up being a little bit illegitimate, the way that things were run, and we will talk about that in a future video. But at one point, one major island in the east called Samos revolted, 441 into 440 BC, and Sophocles teamed up with Pericles, the big leader of Athens, whom you've heard about before, and we'll still hear more about later. The two of them worked together to bring down that revolt. So Sophocles, therefore, did indeed work strenuously on behalf of his native city of Athens to assist Athenian politics to go forward in a pretty ruthless manner, as it turned out. Besides that, one point we know that much later, Sophocles also was in politics again. This time he was acting as an advisor for the Athenians when the Athenians were in disarray by this point. This was in 413 BC. The Athenians had just suffered a huge loss of their fleet on the island of Sicily, and they were investigating their democracy to see if anything should be changed about the way that their democratic legal procedure should be carried out. And Sophocles, now of course quite an old man, gave the advice that there should be a special council called a boule, B-O-U-L-E in Greek, that should give a screening process to the whole procedure for how the General Athenian Assembly received legislation to vote on. He was proposing a council of about 400 people. That was actually put into place, but it had an unintended consequence because that group of 400 would end up helping to overthrow Athenian democracy. So Sophocles, in any event, was active in Athenian politics. At one point, he also served as one of the treasurers on the Athenian Acropolis, responsible for calculating 1/60th of each of the tributes coming in as the tithe to worship Athena. It's very lucky for us that we have lists of all the calculations surviving in stone. That way we're able to know how much tribute each of the member states of the Delian League was responsible to pay for. Apparently Sophocles had a cult of Asclepius at his house, including a pet snake, not surprisingly, and he himself passed away in 406 BC and himself was worshipped with a hero cult. He actually died just a few months before his fellow playwright Euripides, who we'll be hearing about in the third part of the course. And his final play in 406 BC had a chorus that was all dressed in black rags as a commemorative for Euripides, who had just passed away right before that. And again, Sophocles himself passed away just slightly thereafter. Now, Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. And once again, we have the same problem about having only 7 surviving because we have the anthologists who came along and cut away a whole group of his plays that survived to that time, so that unfortunately only 7 plays actually survive. Luckily, they are some of the most impressive pieces of literature we have. So from the standpoint of what actually did survive, the anthologists didn't do too bad a job of getting us ones that really were excellent. Again, as always, though, it's unfortunate that we do not have more of his plays surviving. In any event, Sophocles was successful in being able to win consistently first place and second place, just like Aeschylus. And he was, in fact, so successful that in his first actual production, in which he competed with Aeschylus, he won first place. And thereafter, he was invariably successful in winning either first or second place. We know from later commentators that he had at least 20 victories to his credit, 18 of which were at that City Dionysia festival we spoke about before. As we said at that time, that is one of the most prestigious festivals at which Greeks were invited to come from many different places to Athens to watch. So for Sophocles to win that many times there was really quite impressive. And he was indeed one of the most celebrated of the festivals at that time. We know that Antigone did win, although we do not know exactly what year. And we know that Oedipus at Colonus, which was produced 5 years after his death, also won posthumously for him. Interestingly, Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the king, didn't survive, in fact. Oedipus Tyrannus was the play that Aristotle pointed to in Poetics as the perfect emblematic tragedy, but oddly it didn't win. We don't unfortunately know exactly when Oedipus Tyrannus was produced, but because it has the reference to the plague, and because there was a plague that actually did break out in Athens in 430, 429, 428 BC, in the opening years of the big war with Sparta, we suspect that Oedipus Tyrannus could have been produced in one of those years. Unfortunately, we don't have direct evidence to support that, but it is a likely hypothesis, and most scholars, with nothing else to go on, presume that that's probably when the play was produced. Sophocles, unlike other playwrights, did not actually act in his own plays. He left that to an actor named Tlepolemus, because Sophocles' own voice was not strong enough to be able to carry out acting. So if you turn to page 2 of your handout, you can see some additional details about Sophocles' reputation. Interestingly, he was considered a very easygoing man, as we know from Aristophanes' Frogs. In that comic play, Dionysus, the theater god, has gone down to the underworld to pick up a playwright. He wants Euripides, the dead playwright, to come back from the dead. This play was produced in 405 BC, the year after both Euripides and Sophocles had passed away. And he's joked at by his half-brother Hercules. Well, why do you want Euripides? He's such an awful playwright. He won't do anything to save the city of Athens. The problem here is that if this was near the end of the Peloponnesian War, and if the city of Athens was destroyed in the war, that would be the end of theater, so therefore Dionysus would not receive any more worship as the theater god. So he's asking Hercules how to get down to the underworld, because Hercules had gone there himself before. And so Hercules asks him, why do you want Euripides? Euripides isn't that great. He's a troublemaker. Don't you want Sophocles? He's so much better. And Sophocles, Dionysus says, no. Sophocles is too nice a guy. I need somebody who's a jerk. That's why I want Euripides. So that tells us that Sophocles had the reputation of being a very nice fellow. In general, Sophocles is a lot more dramatic with his use of entrances and exits with the characters. As you'll see when you read the plays have a lot more internal drama to them because now the characters get to talk more and interact more and actually do stuff sometimes even on stage. So therefore the action is quite a bit more vivid than you get with Aeschylus. And sometimes props matter. For instance, the play Philoctetes, in which the bow of Heracles that Philoctetes received that could shoot unerringly becomes a very important prop, because it turns out that the Greeks of Troy need to get it away from him. They've exiled him because he has a snake bite that's really very stinky and also makes him scream all the time. So they send him away, but then they have to get him back because they need the bow in order to be able to conquer Troy. So that bow becomes very important in that particular story. So that happens quite a bit more with Sophocles than happens with Aeschylus. For the standpoint of the styles, he has middle style, which is now, instead of being focused on the gods, we now have a focus on humans, specifically the ideal man, the way that man ought to be, and in particular the way that a man needs to come to terms with tragedy when it occurs. How is one supposed to respond to it? What is the way that one is supposed to resolve a major tragic problem when it comes about? And so the heroes in Sophocles' tragedies are definitely not perfect. They have a lot of flaws. However, the way that they go about trying to resolve the problem is usually in some way successful and ennobling, even though the actual tragedy itself, of course, was not prevented. The characters failed to prevent it, and were not able to actually make anything really better. At least they come to terms with what actually occurred. In particular, as you'll see on page 2, the ancient reputation CV, where it says tragic, anagnorisis, that word refers to recognition. the realization of what one has done in order to cause a tragedy to occur. Unfortunately, it's always too late to either stop the tragedy from happening or to reverse its very unfortunate effects. But the fact that it's even possible to have that recognition is what ennobles these characters and provides for humans a role model for what they're supposed to do. First of all, hopefully to prevent tragedy, but also how to respond to it should it actually occur. So again, because Sophocles was such a winning playwright in his time, he had a very high reputation both then and in much later years, especially again with Aristotle. I should point out that the so-called Freudian complex associated with Oedipus, unfortunately, is not really genuine. Freud does make a reference to Oedipus in his works. We do now, in psychology, speak of the Oedipus complex as being the conflict with between father and son, and the marital connection that can be made between mother and son. But that's not necessarily Freudian in its real description, despite the popular reputation that goes along with that. But in any event, the character of Oedipus has made its way into psychology in that way. As you'll see with Sophocles, there are indeed the 7 plays surviving, given to you in H on page 2. The ones that you're reading, first of all, Electra, which is a retelling of the same story that you saw in Oresteia, specifically the middle play of Aeschylus' trilogy called Libation Bearers or Coryphoroi. That one is pretty much the same story told here, but you'll see, as we'll talk about in more detail, that the focus of Electra is quite a bit different from what you saw in Libation Bearers. There's a lot more focus, as the title suggests, on Electra herself, and Orestes is much more humanized in this one. He's much less dependent on the god Apollo, as you saw with in Aeschylus, and much more motivated by his own need, plus also what the tutor tells him and what Electra tells him to carry out the act of vengeance. And as you'll see also, the tone of the play is quite different all the way through, especially at the end, where the tragedy, as you'll see, is treated quite differently. So that's Electra. And then we have the 3 plays related to Oedipus. You notice that trilogy is in quotes here, because these three plays, although they do form a kind of trilogy thematically, are not actually produced at the same time. The first play written was Antigone, then came Oedipus Tyrannus, and then after Sophocles' death was produced Oedipus at Colonus, which chronologically is actually the middle of the 3 plays. So we are going to read Oedipus, Tyrannus, and Antigone, and then we're going to conclude the Sophocles portion of the class before we get to the midterm exam with Oedipus at Colonus. So as you'll see easily when you read the plays, these plays talk about the unhappy life and career of Oedipus as the king of Thebes, the tragic discovery that he had recently murdered his father and ended up, in fact, marrying his mother, and that had been prophesied in an oracle that had caused him to actually flee what he thought was his birth city of Corinth, away from his mother and father there, only to discover later that they were actually his adopted father and mother, not his real father and mother at Thebes. So there's that tragedy played out. Then he ends up traveling as a beggar. He's blind because he's blinded himself as a result of the discovery of what happened to him. And he eventually arrives in Athens. There is a fracas that goes on having to do with his 2 sons who are back at Thebes now competing. Oedipus is quite upset because the 2 boys are so busy fighting that they don't pay attention to his own needs. He ends up cursing them. And King Creon of Thebes tries to actually get him to come back to Thebes by kidnapping his 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. And that's because there was another oracle that said that if whoever was able to get Oedipus buried at that person's own city would bring great profit to the city. Interestingly, the place where Oedipus ends up, Athens, is the one that ends up being where he gets buried, and that's because of the oversight of King Theseus of Athens to successfully bring Oedipus into the region of Athens and be able to get him properly buried. So that's Oedipus of Colonus. And Antigone retells the same story that you saw at the end of Seven Against Thebes of Aeschylus, the conflict between Antigone and Ismene. Only this time the story is carried quite a bit further. We now actually see Antigone carry out the burial of her brother Polynices, the one who had been condemned to a lack of state burial. We see the punishment inflicted upon her by King Creon, who is actually her uncle, but still nonetheless has to carry this punishment out on behalf of the state. Creon's son Haemon was actually betrothed to Antigone, and Antigone ends up shut up in a cave where she will end up committing suicide with her marriage veil. And Tiresias the prophet warns Creon that he's actually made a terrible mistake by punishing Antigone this way, because the gods object to the fact that the body was left unburied. So Creon gets the body buried, rushes over to the cave with Haemon, and unfortunately it turns out that Antigone has actually committed suicide. And when Haemon discovers this, he tries to stab his father, and then ends up actually stabbing himself. And also Creon's wife Eurydice dies as well. So Creon, in a way, ends up actually being the tragic hero in a way, even though the focus is on Antigone, because he's the one who has to go through the anagnorisis of realizing that he had been too rigid in his application of state law. Okay, well, that should give you the information that you need for Sophocles. We hope that you will be able to make use of this, and we'll come back and start talking about Athenian history, and we'll discuss those 4 plays in detail in later videos. We'll see you in the next video.